Hello and welcome to Small Business Snippets, the podcast from smallbusiness.co.uk. I'm your host, Anna Jordan. For the next few months, we'll be looking at small business milestones. Think landing your first client, turning a profit, and even your first major setback. In the studio, we have Simon Hill, founder of Wazoku, a cloud-based idea management software platform. In the spirit of smashing your goals, we're going to talk about how the company reached a £1 million annual rate of return. Hello, Simon.
Hi there.
How are you doing?
I'm very good, thank you. How are you?
Great, not bad at all, yeah. So let's get cracking. How did it feel reaching the 1 million mark?
So it does feel like a huge milestone. I think, we read lots of things about that being one of those critical moments of a business. Lots don't make it to that. There are big stats out there of 90% or 80% never make it to that kind of key milestone.
How did you celebrate?
I don't think we did anything massive for it as an organization, because you start to look at the next million almost the next day.
So how did you get to that point?
I wish there was one secret answer to all of that, but I don't think there is. As I said, it took us quite a bit longer than if you look at the investment documents that we went out and raised money on in the early days. We said we would, right? Lots of straight lines going up towards that million much quicker. In the end, it took us just over 4 years to get there. And there was, lots of things that were good on the way to that, but lots of things that were, missteps and misadventures as well. Ultimately, we're a software as a service business that sells a licensed fee product into corporates. And so we have to sell lots of those things to lots of corporates to get that £1 million number. So we learned a lot at different stages, and you think you're getting there, you think you've got that momentum, and then something else comes along that makes you sort of take 2 steps backwards again, and you have to figure it out. So there was loads of learnings across that journey.
Go into a little bit more detail about some of the examples of those learnings, and possibly something that our listeners can learn from.
So I think you may have done other podcasts on this where you've looked at people getting their first client, but for us that was quite a big milestone, and just figuring out who we were and what we were trying to do. So in the very start of the organization, we were mostly targeting small organizations, but in the preceding 6 years or 6 years ago, the market really wasn't ready for that. So early customers coming on board, buying the product, seeming to like it, but needing more help. And so we had to look, and we did that classic thing that everyone probably likes to call a pivot. We changed who we were targeting, right? And we started to look at larger organizations and to build a market from the bottom up, using corporates as the kind of the hook for all of that. Our first big corporate client was the BBC. It was by no fluke, really, other than it really kind of was, that our landlord at the time was the BBC. So we were a small business. We were looking for somewhere cheap to rent an office space. We found a building in White City that was called the Ugly Building, and it was ugly by name, ugly by nature. And around the time we moved in, the BBC CTO at the time put a statement out saying that the BBC was looking to do more with startups, and that it was willing to help them, and that anyone wanted to should contact him. So we just did directly. We picked up the phone and we were on site, and he agreed to meet us there and then. And actually, just by being proactive with that, we were able to, after about a year, it took a long time, right, actually get a contract in the BBC, working directly with them. But there's a huge amount of luck and brinkmanship that comes into that. It's actually quite an interesting story just with the BBC, which I can jump into if you'd like me to.
Yeah, please.
So at the time that we were selling to the BBC, and I think they know this, but I don't mind if they don't, we were also trying to sell to ITV as well. And so the story to ITV was that we had BBC as a client, and the story to BBC was they had ITV as a client. And as you have to do in the early days of startup world, you are sometimes a little bit more adventurous with the truth than maybe you would be nowadays, which was fine, except at the final point of kind of validation, we were asked by both parties if we could get a reference back from the client that we were working with, how it was working with us and everything else. And so I had to go to ITV and ask them if they would give us a reference, not as a client necessarily, but how it had been working with us through the process, and if they test their water, whether they would do it or not. And luckily we'd done such good work with them just in the process of trying to get them on board, and I could be honest with them and tell them that the BBC weren't yet a client, but we'd done this, that they actually did give a reference for us, and they actually took the call. And so I think a lot of that goes into how you operate as a business. People know that you're starting up. They know that you've got to be a little bit creative sometimes. And we didn't lie, but we did definitely bend some truths in that process. But people stood up for us, and it came good for us in the end.
So tell me a bit more about the relationship that you had with the BBC in terms of what you exactly supplied for them. How does that partnership work?
We believe fundamentally that every little change starts with an idea, and that in order to drive change, what you need to do are connecting the right people and the right ideas to the right problems at the right time. And too often through time, we have loads of people who have loads of ideas, but they don't know where to take them to. And so we're trying to use technology to make it better, or to make businesses better at connecting ideas and people to problems at the time that the business needs those things. In the BBC's perspective, or point of view, that was, how can we make sure that when TV shows at the time, things like Top Gear were big earners for them, but they knew they were coming towards end of life, or things like Blue Planet. Right. How can they use the great creatives that they have inside the BBC, who have brilliant ideas for new creative TV shows, to come up with to match the need of we need to fill that big slot of a next Doctor Who, a next Top Gear, whatever it is, with the specific people and the specific ideas for those shows at the time where those things happen, or where they're required, rather than relying on expensive commissioning of outside people, which happens quite a lot, or on some other process that was highly inefficient, sitting in rooms and brainstorming other things. And we're still building 6 years down the line some of the features that were requested back then by the BBC that I thought were, perhaps we even thought they were a bit mad about them, but maybe some of the things they were looking to do, we just didn't understand at the time as well. I think it's also difficult with those big companies, right? So we had to learn how to sell to large corporates. It is pretty difficult, and I still read contracts on a daily basis that make no sense for software in 2018. I think one of the things I had to warrant against when signing for the BBC was that I wouldn't employ clowns as part of my business, because because they're normally commissioning TV shows and what they were looking for, and I had to quibble this with the lawyers because it's not relevant, and that's just a silly example of the types of things that you get for businesses that are still not that good at buying software. And so it can be difficult as a startup. You don't really know the processes, and you don't really know how to sell to these large companies to get there.
I bet they've had the same processes in place for a while now, so it must be
I'm
quite
sure
difficult to integrate that change rather than a startup who are more flexible. Yeah,
we work in the space that's loosely going to be coined innovation, and I think the stats out there that there's 50,000 Google searches a month for what is innovation. And that's one start just to itself, right? And so, and then what does that mean inside your business, and how do you do it? Such to the point that we really don't like the term innovation anymore. And it's trying to find the human bit of that and figure out where you sit, not just latch onto a big word that's probably been a bit broken by marketeers and consultants or whatever else it might be. And so think really long and hard about what sector you really think you're in, and how do you bring the human element of that to bear in the marketing materials that you've got, and draw the best leads that you can.
Coming back a wee bit, you talked about how it took 4 years to reach the 1 million, and it's not the straight up line that you envisaged when you started out. How did the outcome of reaching that milestone differ to your original vision, and how is that going to help you in growing further?
So I think, and I don't remember the exact numbers of all of this, but I was sat in a training event of some description about 6 months ago, and someone drew up a couple of kind of crunch points of organisations, and I think one was around about £500,000, and another one was at about 2 or 2.5 million or whatever it is, and I sort of looked back at where we were in terms of the milestones and thought of the bits that could I identify with those things, right? Were there bits that we hit and we thought, wow, we've got momentum, we're moving, we're going in the right direction, and suddenly you stall? And we were about those sort of levels. And then I remember lots of people sort of nodding their heads and thinking about that and wondering why. And they kind of identified a couple of things, which I think are true, is that they tend to be the points where you hit scaling issues. So that, right, you've got as many people as you can just about manage to hire, right? We're all running on pretty much fresh air in terms of the amount of capacity we've got in our days, and we all wish we could hire more and more and more people in the businesses as we grow, but you normally can't. And so part of that is that there are only so many hours and so many jobs that one person can do before you start to stretch, and they typically align to milestones in terms of revenue, because you start to then flatten out because you just can't do anymore. And so that was one of the things that for sure was that we knew we needed more people, but we hadn't, raised money ahead of it, or hadn't delivered the business to the right point to be able to support all of that, or just hadn't recognized it at all. And I think the other is that you sell these things and you drive good revenues, but we had a little bit of a leaky bucket on the other side. And so if you're selling 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 pounds of business a year, which is great in those early years, now those are kind of months for us, or maybe less, but in general, those are solid, years of worth of business. But if you've got 20, 30, 40% churn, then you have to address that issue, because you've got to start selling 50, 60, 100,000 pounds worth of business just to stand still. And that could, in some instances, could be your whole year's worth of business. And so for us, it was like we'd sort of got the process right of how do we sell this thing, and how do we market it. And we were building a brand new sector from the ground up, right? It wasn't like there was anyone out there really doing what we were doing when we first started. And so those early numbers were quite good numbers versus the kind of total addressable market that was probably out there at that point in time. But we started to lose customers out the other side. And so that meant that we needed more people, which meant that we needed more process and more customer service side of things to keep those customers on board. I don't think this is rocket science to anybody, but, because we probably know it. But I would have probably done that earlier, because it would have saved me a whole lot more pain. And it would have been better to have kept those first batch of customers who we just didn't give the necessary love that they needed to keep them on board. There was nothing wrong with the product. It was just that we weren't giving them what they needed. And it was more expensive for me to go and get the next versions of them than it was, to have kept them in the first place. But you don't look like that. You're constantly looking at growth through new business all of the time.
What kind of advice do you have for entrepreneurs and they're setting out their financial targets?
So I think it's really difficult, and I think so I've been quite lucky, and I get a little bit more involved in advising and also investing in some early businesses. So I kind of I'm still out there raising money for my own business, and I also sit on the other side of the table and advise people. You're caught a little bit between a rock and a hard place, because you want to sell the best story you can. Yeah. That's what investors want to hear. On the other side of the table, the investors are, on the whole, halving the number that you're giving them, doubling the amount of time that it'll take to get there, and doubling the cost it'll take to get there as well. And so there's a little bit of a game in all of that as you go forward. I think the balancing act, and quite honestly, one of the things that we haven't done that well as a business to date, is balancing that piece between what you go out and say you're going to try and achieve, when we both know on both sides of the table there's definitely a game going on here, and then marrying that back into the actual budgets and deliverables of an organization. Because actually the worst thing for organizations to do is to overpromise and underdeliver. Not necessarily to investors. I'm not saying we should go out there and lie, or that we should go out there and spin one set of numbers to an investor and then a totally different set of numbers on an operating model within the business. But finding a balance between the story that we're trying to sell in terms of growth and the near-term sets of numbers that we can actually deliver as a business is probably one of the most important bits to try and get right. And we, until probably the last 12, 18 months, have been equally bad at overpromising and mostly under-delivering, even though we're still delivering really strong double-digit, almost triple-digit growth in the business. We promise more because you still always believe you can hit the stars and everything else. And that is a big balancing act, right? Yeah. We weren't very good at allowing for seasonality. It didn't strike me, because I work very hard, that actually increasingly, even in the UK, though we sell globally, that most people shut down for 6 weeks over the summer. Even if they're in work, the key people they need to sign things off aren't typically around, and decisions don't get made. And so there are big chunks of the year, especially when dealing with big businesses, that are really, they're not trading periods anymore as far as I'm concerned. And so getting that balance right and your forecasts right and really understanding the market you're in isn't particularly sexy, but it is vital when you're trying to get this stuff right with forecasting what's going to happen next.
Great. Well, that's it from me, unless you have anything else you'd like to add.
No, I don't think so. Unless you want to guess what language Wazoku is and what it means. The closing hook.
Oh, that's a good one. Oh, I don't know. I haven't a clue what it means. Language?
What do you think?
Swahili?
It actually is Swahili, yeah.
Okay.
Dude, that was a great guess. All good research and good pretending. So it means great idea in Swahili. And there are loads of reasons why, but I will let people do their own research on why I have a Swahili business name.
You can find out more about Wazoku at wazoku.com. You can also visit smallbusiness.co.uk for more guidance on calculating returns. Remember to follow us on Facebook at smallbusiness.co.uk and Twitter at smallbusinessuk, all lowercase. Join us next time when I'll be chatting to a business owner about how he found the perfect head of customer care. Until then, thank you for listening.